Hello, everyone. We're pleased that you're joining us for this webinar called Laying a Foundation, Defining Arts Integration. This webinar comes to you from the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. My name is Amy Duma. I'm Director of Teacher and School Programs at the Kennedy Center, and I'll be leading the webinar today. For the webinar, you may be interested in downloading the handout that goes with it. Here are the instructions for doing that. You can pause the webinar and go ahead and download the handout, or you can download the handout later on. It will be up there on the wiki. So we're really going to be looking at a definition for arts integration that was developed by the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. The definition will either be an introduction for you, or it will provide a way for you to further clarify and refine your thinking and work that you've already been doing in arts integration. What I hope today's webinar will do is to establish a common vocabulary for your work in your school, whether you're viewing this by yourself or others from your school. So before we begin talking about arts integration, let's talk about how arts integration fits into a bigger picture of how the arts are taught in schools. We've noticed that there are three main ways that the arts are taught in schools. All are necessary and needed and valid. First, there is arts as curriculum. This is where students develop their knowledge and skills in an art form. If your school has a music, art, drama, or dance teacher, their focus is most likely on teaching about the art form. We often hear these arts education programs referred to as arts learning or arts for art's sake. The second way that the arts are taught in schools is when the arts are used to enhance other curriculum areas. Here, the primary focus is on the other curriculum area, and the arts are used to complement that instruction. A very simple example is when students sing the ABCs. So music is a means to another end, like remembering the alphabet sequence, but there's no learning about the art form that's taking place. And the third way that the arts are taught in schools is arts integration. Here, students learn by exploring connections between the arts and other subject areas to gain greater understanding in both. So as I mentioned earlier, all three of these ways, the arts as curriculum, arts enhanced curriculum, and arts integrated curriculum are all necessary, needed, and valid. All three of these approaches are supported by arts experiences, where students attend performance and exhibits by professional artists, and they learn to become increasingly more perceptive audience members. For today, however, we're really going to focus just on arts integrated curriculum. You'll also notice that arts integrated curriculum can be taught either by art specialists and or classroom teachers. We typically find that arts as curriculum is taught by the art specialists, arts enhanced curriculum by classroom teachers, but arts integrated curriculum can be taught by either one or by those teachers collaborating together. So we'll focus on arts integration, and if you want to be following along in the handout that you downloaded, the page numbers for the handout will always be in the upper left corner of the slides. So the session today will focus on the defining characteristics of arts integration. What is arts integration? It's not going to be about how to do arts integration in the classroom. There's many professional development opportunities offered by the Kennedy Center and other organizations that help teachers learn those strategies for integrating the arts. But for our purposes today, this webinar is going to focus on understanding the big ideas about arts integration. I mentioned that this definition was developed by the Kennedy Center. The Kennedy Center has been working in this area for 4 decades now of offering professional development for teachers to help them implement arts integration and arts programs in their school. Today, there's more than 700 teachers who participate each year in programs at the Kennedy Center. So as we get started, let's take a look at an example of what one class's journey in arts integration might look like. We can use this as an example then as we move through the rest of the webinar. So we'll look at an example of the integration between solar system and dance. And you'll see a third grade classroom in a Title I school. This is a school where 75% of the students are English language learners. The teacher created this documentation after attending a Kennedy Center course with some dance teaching artists that looked at how to integrate dance and science. The entire lesson took 3 45-minute sessions. So let's take a look at what we call Sundance example. is one example of what arts integration might look like in the classroom. It's interesting to note that there are many definitions for arts integration across the country. They have common characteristics and some are more comprehensive than others. So the Kennedy Center spent like a year and a half reviewing definitions and looking at the work that we were doing in schools dedicated to arts integration, and ultimately we developed our own comprehensive definition. So let's take a look at that now. Arts integration is an approach to teaching in which students construct and demonstrate understanding through an art form. Students engage in a creative process which connects an art form and another subject area and meets evolving objectives in both. Notice that some of the words are enlarged and in color, and so we're going to be zeroing in on those words to really unpack them a bit more so that we can talk through the definition and gain a better understanding of it. So let's start by focusing on this part of the definition. Students engage in a creative process. Let's look at a diagram of the creative process. There's many different models, but this one is kind of a synthesis of various versions. Notice that the process is flexible. There are ways to enter at different points. There is no attempt to assign a sequence. You can enter at different points and you can jump around between different steps of the creative process. If we think back to the Sundance example, when students created their dance, they imagined, examined, and perceived. They explored and experimented. They created a dance. They reflected and assessed it, and they revised it and shared it with others. That's the process that the students went through. And that's another important piece of it here, is that students are the ones doing the problem solving. They are the ones doing the creating. It's not necessarily the teachers doing this. So this was included in the objectives under dance, that students would be engaged in the creative process. So until you involve students in the creative process, you really haven't moved into the land of arts integration. The creative process naturally links us to the arts. And in the definition, if we go back to it, there's another part that says, through an art form. The arts are a powerful way to help students learn because they connect to multiple learning modalities. So as you know, a learning modality refers to the ways that students take in information. Traditionally, we see three different learning modalities: visual, oral, and kinesthetic. And we've noticed that educational researchers are recognizing the powerful benefits of teaching through a wider range of modalities. The wonderful thing about arts integration is that when we bring arts into the classroom, the arts by their very nature are offering multiple modalities for learning, and they offer students multiple ways to represent that learning. We also know that when students learn through the arts, that their engagement is high. They remember what they learned and it sticks with them. If we look at the Sundance example, we can see that the kinesthetic learning modality is front and center in this work. That doesn't mean that the students weren't involved in visual and oral learning modalities. They would have been doing that when they were reading and discussing and researching ahead of creating their dance. But the arts provide a great exemplar for teaching through multiple modalities. And while many educators are seeking ways to do this, the arts are leading the way. So the big takeaway here is that arts integration is supported by current research about the power of engaging students in learning through multiple modalities. Looking back at our definition, what do we mean by students demonstrate their understanding? Well, here we're referring to the idea that knowing something is different from understanding it. Knowing is based on facts. Understanding builds on those facts, but goes beyond the information given. So if we think about Bloom's taxonomy, knowledge of facts is the lowest level of thinking according to Bloom. The definition for arts integration aims at higher order thinking. We want students to progress up through Bloom's taxonomy and get to the highest level of the revised Bloom's taxonomy, which is creating. In your handout, there's a diagram that will show the distinction between knowledge and understanding. And in the Sundance example, we noticed that the dance expressed our understanding of these indications in science and these objectives in dance. We want to help students understand rather than just knowing and trying to remember facts. So if we consider an example, when students sing the ABCs, they have a mnemonic device to help them recall the sequence of the letters, but they're not demonstrating their understanding. We don't know if they understand that letters are linked with sounds or that letters can be put together to form words. Now, do we want them to sing the ABCs? Yes, of course. They need to establish that knowledge. Singing the ABCs would fall under arts enhancing other curriculum, but it doesn't cross the line into arts integration. In the Sundance example, we see that clearly here, where we are looking at students constructing and demonstrating their understanding of both science and dance. And when they did this, the teacher then had an authentic embedded assessment of student learning. So when students are engaged in arts integration, the teacher is able to assess what students know and understand by observing their work and listening to how they reflect on it. It's quick and it works. So normally when I leave this session for teachers, we have a moment here where we have a chance to pause and talk about the big ideas that we've just been exploring. So we won't be doing that, of course, during this webinar, but let me point out the big ideas that we have talked about. So arts integration includes the creative process. It incorporates different learning modalities, and it moves students from knowledge to understanding. So those are the big ideas we've explored so far. Let's go on to another part of the definition, which here we look at connects an art form and another subject area. So when we're talking about connections, there's basically two options. The first is connecting an arts focus to a specific curriculum area. Think about the Sundance example. The arts focus was dance and was connected to a specific curriculum area, the study of the solar system in science. The second type of connection is from an arts focus to a school's particular concern or need. Concerns would fall outside the standard curriculum. It might be an example of character education, or other concerns might be multiple intelligences, multicultural awareness, or safety issues. But we found that it's not enough just to make a connection. The connection must be mutually reinforcing. This means that by engaging in learning in one area, we're reinforcing or extending learning in the other. In the Sundance example, the dance, in the handout, there are examples of connections listed in pages 15 to 22 that gives you some more examples of that. In the Sundance example, we saw that students were thinking about these big ideas of energies, cycles, and patterns that are relevant to both the science content and the dance content. So mutually reinforcing connections are at the heart of arts integration. And if we're living in the land of arts integration, we have a connection between an art form and another subject area, or between a connection between an art form and a school concern or need. And that connection must be mutually reinforcing. Let's continue unpacking the definition. So the next part focuses on meets evolving objectives in both. So let's talk first about objectives, and then we'll talk about evolving objectives. So as you know, students are focused on learning objectives that say what they will know, be able to do, and appreciate. And our objectives are aligned with state or local standards. So if we look back at the Sundance example, there were objectives in both dance and science. So I'm sure that all of you who are classroom teachers are very familiar with objectives and standards in the areas of the curriculum that you teach, like social studies, science, English language arts, and math. But you may be less familiar with the objectives and standards in the arts. Now, when there's little or no instruction in the art form, the work that the students create, whether they're doing dramatizations or visual art or dances, will usually fall short of meeting standards of quality that students are expected to achieve in the arts. But by introducing objectives in both the art form and the other subject area, we're highlighting that each area has its own body of knowledge and skills to learn. So it really emphasizes that creating in the arts requires learning and hard work. It's not simply a matter of talent. So the big idea here is that until you teach with objectives in both the art form and the other subject area, you haven't moved into the land of arts integration. So let's extend this notion of objectives a little bit more by talking about evolving objectives. It's kind of like scaffolding. It's monitoring student progress and adjusting instruction to keep students challenged. So simply repeating the same arts activity without raising the level of challenge would be a mistake. The same way that objectives in the other subject area evolve over time, we would expect that the objectives in the art form should also evolve as students' experience and readiness evolve over time. So let's take a look at the Sundance as an example. So these objectives under dance are not beginning of the year objectives. In dance, the objectives at the beginning of the year might be to find personal space, to be able to respond to cues to stop and start, and to be able to freeze and hold their balance. A dance that includes those would be great, but later in the year, our objectives need to evolve over time so that we include things like contrasting energies and choreographing with patterns that are listed here on this slide. By the end of the year, the dances are at a much higher skill level. They're more interesting, and the students find them more interesting as well. So at the beginning of the year, we found that teachers make an investment that really pays off. They include objectives in the art form that develop students' abilities to develop their vocabulary in the art form, to develop their skills in the art form, and ultimately to get to the place where they can engage in the creative process. So our discussion about these dual objectives leads us into a related idea. Since arts integration requires that we identify objectives in the arts and another subject area, how do we teach to both? How does that work when we're a teacher in a classroom and we're doing arts integration on our own? We've noticed that from lesson to lesson within a unit, the balance of instruction shifts between an arts focus and the other subject area. So sometimes we have lessons that focus on dance, and sometimes we have lessons that will focus on science. And eventually they come together in one lesson. So let's look at an example and imagine a 5-lesson sequence for integrating dance and science. It could be any number of lessons, and it could be over any given span of time, but this is what we'll use as an example. So our diagram here shows in lesson 1 that there's only dance objectives, and in lesson 2, only science objectives. That might be how a unit or a series of lessons starts out. Then in lesson 3, we see that the scale is weighted to the left, indicating a lesson where we have both science and dance being taught, but where dance has more weight. Dance is the primary focus and the science has a secondary focus. For lesson 4, we see that the scale is weighted on the right, indicating that we have objectives in both areas, but the science has more weight. And finally, by lesson 5, we reach a balance of instruction where both dance and science are carrying equal weight. So in the Sundance example, these are the objectives in dance. These might be a lesson 1 example where the teacher is only focusing on dance objectives, or it could be a lesson 3 example where the focus is on dance objectives, but we do have a secondary focus on science. And then, of course, there were the science objectives. This could be a lesson 2 where the teacher is teaching only the science objectives, or it could possibly be 4, where in lesson 4 there are objectives in both, but it is heavily weighted towards the science. Ultimately, for arts integration, you have to be familiar with both content areas so that you can look for those mutually reinforcing connections and you can lead the instruction in meaningful ways. I'll also add that the teachers in schools who are arts teachers, visual art, music teachers, dance or drama teachers are wonderful resources to help support classroom teachers when they're integrating the arts. But our Kennedy Center definition does not imply that there has to be collaboration between classroom teachers and art specialists. It also doesn't imply that we have to have a teaching artist in the classroom. We've noticed that with appropriate professional development that classroom teachers can learn to teach the dance-only content on their own. Also, think about the implications of this shifting balance for visitors to a classroom. So if someone were to walk into your classroom to observe at any moment, and you mentioned that you were going to be doing arts integration, but they walked in on either lesson 1 or lesson 2 and saw you only teaching dance or only teaching science, they would kind of wonder where the integration piece was. So it's important that you can explain to them and help them understand that they're entering at a specific lesson during a whole sequence of lessons that will lead up to the final lesson 5 where everything comes together. All right, so again, we would stop and talk about this, but here are the big ideas that we've been talking about. Arts integration includes mutually reinforcing connections. It includes evolving objectives in both the art form and the other subject area, and includes a shifting balance of instruction. So let's move on and continue to unpack the definition by focusing on the first phrase, arts integration is an approach to teaching. We're putting the emphasis on teaching here to make it clear that arts integration influences both what you teach and how you teach. So rather than just being an add-on or an extra, we really see arts integration is fundamental to the way that you would select content and the way that you teach it. Now, of course, as an educational field, we have shifted our ideas about teaching over time. And this shift has really implications for arts integration as what we consider to be an approach to teaching. So it's helpful to know some context, something about where we've been as teachers and where the teaching field is going. So let's take a look at a short video that looks at some of the changing attitudes and beliefs about education over the last 100 years. There, of course, have been many influences, and we won't have a chance to explore them all. But we will start back at the turn of the 20th century and then kind of take a look at some of the major changes that took place over time. The video also looks ahead and reflects on new thinking that's changing our view of education today. Please note that there's also additional resources about the people and books mentioned in this video on the same wiki that I referred to earlier, where you could download your handout. Well, the industrial model of education is certainly evolving into something new. Current brain research is rapidly changing what we know and believe about learning. So let's go ahead and return to our definition. And this time, let's put the emphasis on approach. Arts integration is an approach to teaching. Your approach is how you teach or the way you teach rather than what you teach. And the way you teach is something that's typically based on your beliefs about how students learn. You will see here 6 big beliefs about learning. I believe that learning is actively built, experiential, reflective, and evolving. Learning is collaborative and involves problem solving. These 6 beliefs about learning are foundational beliefs of a theory of learning called constructivism. They are also aligned with the approach to teaching we call arts integration. Your own approach to teaching is based on your beliefs about learning. What's interesting to note is that our beliefs and our teaching practice sometimes align and sometimes don't. That's our challenge, to align our beliefs in our practice. In the handout, there is a chart with the 6 beliefs along the left column, and the middle column includes consistent practice with those beliefs, and the right column is inconsistent practice with the beliefs. If you have your handout, you can take a look at that now. But I will give you one example. So one of the beliefs is that learning is experiential. And consistent practice in the classroom would include things like students engaging in hands-on activities and students demonstrating their learning through visual, kinesthetic, dramatic, and other ways. Inconsistent practice would be that students learn mainly from textbooks and worksheets. So you can see that consistent practice is really aligned with constructivism and arts integration, and inconsistent practice is following a traditional approach to teaching. So how aligned are your beliefs and your approach to teaching? As you can imagine, the way that we teach has been the focus of much research and discussion. Frequently, the discussion focuses on contrasting older traditional ways of teaching with newer ways. So there's the 2 basic approaches to teaching are included on this chart here. The first approach is traditional with a big T, and we saw some of that in the video. The second approach is constructivism with a big C. And we see that, as I mentioned earlier, as closely being aligned with arts integration. But rarely do we find that teachers would live on the far end of the spectrums. So there are variations in the middle where most teachers would find themselves. This second box is big T, smaller c, means predominantly a traditional approach, but with some aspects of constructivism. And the third box, big C, smaller t, represents a predominantly constructivist approach, but some aspects of a traditional approach. As you can imagine, the environments in the 2 classrooms would be very different. If you walked into a big T classroom, it would look completely different from a classroom that was more aligned with constructivism. So why am I bringing this up? We know that the arts have a place in every classroom, and they can be taught anywhere along this continuum. However, arts integration is a particular approach to teaching, and it lives down on this end of the continuum that's predominantly a constructivist approach. So constructivism really helps provide the climate and conditions for the creative work that is so inherent in arts integration. It's not important where you are right now on this continuum, but whether you're willing to take the journey towards this type of teaching on the constructivist end. The big understanding here is that arts integration is an entire approach to teaching. It's not just one activity that is done at 2 p.m. on Fridays. It's rooted in foundational beliefs about how students learn and how teachers teach. There's more information on the wiki that I mentioned earlier about constructivism and arts integration. So again, these are the big ideas we talked about so far, how arts integration aligns with constructivism, and specifically these 6 learning principles, and this continuum of instruction from a traditional approach to a constructivist approach, and arts integration lives on the end with constructivism. So why are we so interested in arts integration? Nationally, we're really seeing an increased interest, and it comes as no surprise because arts integration helps teachers reach diverse learners. Our classrooms are filled with students from various cultural, academic, and economic backgrounds, and arts integration helps reach all of them. Arts integration is also based on current research that tells us about how children learn best. Third, arts integration helps prepare students for the 21st century by equipping them with the tools and skills that they're going to need. And finally, arts integration motivates, engages, and it energizes learners as well as educators. It makes the classroom a fun place to be. On the handout that's on the wiki, there is an arts integration checklist which you can use as you are planning your own arts integrated units or when you're observing somebody else's. It takes all of the information from this definition and puts it into an easy checklist form. In order to access other resources, here's information about going to the wiki and finding where these documents live. So as we close out of this session, wanted to show you one more example of what arts integration can look like in a classroom. This will be a 3rd grade classroom at a Title I school, again with approximately 75% learners of English, and this took place in one 45-minute session. So let's take a look at Martin's Big Words. So one more example, a powerful example of arts integration. We are coming to the end of our webinar. I want to thank you for participating in the webinar. Feel free to email me with any comments or questions. And also feel free to visit our website to learn more about what the Kennedy Center is doing in the area of arts integration. Thank you for attending our webinar today and for your interest and work in arts integration.